This podcast is brought to you by Conquer Cancer, the ASCO Foundation. Our mission is to accelerate breakthroughs in life-saving research and empower people everywhere to conquer cancer. Welcome to Your Stories, a podcast where we hear candid stories from people conquering cancer. I'm your host, Dr. Mark Lewis. The year was 1991. With the Soviet Union collapsing, hundreds of thousands of refugees fled to other countries. Among them was a teenage girl who, along with her family, had escaped the small country of Azerbaijan, a former Soviet republic, and who would eventually settle in California. Fast forward almost 34 years to June 1st, 2025. That young girl is now Dr. Yelena Janjigian, a highly respected oncologist and researcher, standing on stage at a Chicago convention center. Now, as thousands of her peers look on, she's about to present results from a major clinical trial, one with the potential to change the treatment landscape for patients with gastric cancers. It is a moment set in motion, not by a single college degree or grant application or donation, but by an almost infinite series of decisions and choices, some hers, some by others, some major, some comparatively minor, but each of them significant for the role they played in where she is today. Not to mention the countless lives that will ultimately be saved as a result. Dr. Janjigian, thank you so much for being here with us today. It is truly an honor to have you on our show.
Thank you, Mark, for these kind words of introduction, and the honor is truly mine.
I meant every word of it, and you're richly deserving, as we'll discuss. Before we get started, Yelena, tell us where you're joining from today.
I am a medical oncologist, and I work in New York at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center.
Wonderful. Such a prestigious institution, and your work continues, I think, a long and stellar history of truly practice-changing studies to come out of your center. So congratulations for continuing that lineage. So first, I don't want to get too deep into maybe the science of oncology research immediately, because I know a lot of our listeners aren't researchers. But I do have to say, as your peer, as someone that got to see you speak in Chicago, just how much I enjoyed, genuinely, your presentation earlier this summer during the ASCO Annual Meeting. What I tell my patients when I'm going to this meeting, Yelena, is it's like our Super Bowl. And
yes, I say the same thing.
Yeah, it's just a nice...
Exactly. Well, I'm explaining it to my parents because they couldn't...
My mother once referred to ASCO as the science fair, which I thought was really quite adorable. So yes, whether it's our parents or our patients, we have the shorthand. And my analogy goes on to say that if ASCO, the annual meeting as a whole, is the Super Bowl, I think the plenary session is kind of like the halftime show, because it gets the most eyeballs and ears. And again, it's truly an honor for a researcher like yourself to be able to present practice-changing data there. So again, colleague to colleague, but for our audience, tell us, what's it like standing in front of that stage, in front of so many brilliant people in the audience, presenting work that you've done that is truly the culmination of years of effort? I mean, can you explain, at least for a listener who might not have even been to the meeting, what that moment means, not just for your career, but also for patients and families who are facing this disease?
It's an incredible emotional moment that took probably close to 8 years plus, and 1,000-patient study, 984 patient study, but also probably not overestimating 100 people plus in staff and collaborators, investigators, to get to that point. And even just coordination of submission of the data, having everyone okay with presenting this data and in different formats and so forth. It was an incredibly emotional moment. In fact, practicing, and part of, this halftime show, like any other halftime show, you practice. Yeah. And I'm incredibly lucky to have a, supportive network of trusted physicians, because this is embargo data, so you can't really tell anyone about it. So you're keeping the secret, and as you're supposed to polish your presentation and be really, you only have less than, barely 12 minutes to present this data, and you have to be perfect, and it's going to be played over and over and over again. So all of this key information has to be, it's patient care, so you have to get it just right. So I can tell you again, when we were practicing during some of the last practice sessions, actually during the acknowledgement slide, I became emotional. Yes. And so then I was so worried that I was going to start crying on stage in front of 20,000 people. So it's a buildup, and it's this moment of really doing, because I'm just a representative of so many more patients and people and caregivers and so forth. So I wanted to get it just right, and of course I always put too much pressure on everything. So it was quite a moment, and incredible.
Well, again, you're being very self-effacing because I think you're casting yourself as a mouthpiece, and you certainly did a fantastic job of explaining the study, but you also were sort of the prime mover in the entire investigation. And I'll tell you a couple of things. One is, the sort of synthesis of your head and your heart came across. I mean, yes, you were explaining data with a great degree of scientific rigor, but it really was obvious to us, how much it meant to you. It's become almost a trope, actually, I think a welcome one at the end of these presentations for researchers to thank the patients. I think you did a particularly admirable job of that, and it really came across to me as authentic. And then finally, we use this term practice changing data. I think that's exactly what this was. Am I correct in remembering, did you have a simultaneous publication in the New England Journal of Medicine you also had to prepare in sync?
Yes. So that's perfect coordination of, again, making sure everyone's happy and sort of feels that the presentation was just so, but also the paper and the timing of the presentation. And then New England Journal of Medicine was just, again, an incredible experience, and coordination of all of these pieces was something to get through and still try to hold on to that moment. And I think as oncologists, as physicians and so forth, we know these moments are so rare to come by in any lifetime. And so I wanted to actively enjoy it and remind myself to enjoy it, but I don't know if I did.
Right.
It was just much.
Yeah, no, and I'm glad, like you said, I'm glad it's recorded and documented. So at some point, even you can go back and watch it. Um, as we alluded to in the intro, Yelena, this is sort of the culmination of a lot of things that have happened, not just in your career, but in your life. And it's such an inspiring story. I'm sure there's much more to your narrative than we can cover in a single episode. But, as I was sort of going through your very synoptic biography, it's impossible not to hear that and wonder, where would you and your family be today in every sense had you ultimately settled anywhere else? I mean, do you ever wonder about that, sort of the sliding doors moment? And if so, do you have any answers?
Yeah, I think it depends on where, as a Armenian, individual growing up in Azerbaijan, and as, again, going by my parents and my family's experience, I don't think I would have had an opportunity to be a physician in that country because, again, there was a clear limitation of who got to be, a physician, and it's a prestigious, position anywhere in the world. And so to be a relative minority, and, you wouldn't be able to do that. So I think my parents, certainly that courage it took to leave and come to a foreign country. And again, I couldn't have become anything but what they were really, were aspired us to be, which is successful researchers and scientists. I think if I stayed, probably my plan was to become a more of a linguistic kind of literature person. I've always loved, I always write. So I think I was going to go down the path of either being a professor somewhere teaching writing or staying in sort of the softer, the less hard sciences. But
Yeah.
I was always very interested in that piece, and I'm good at languages and writing.
But as you said, it's one thing to do the science, and it's completely another to communicate it both to patients and to your peers in a manner that can immediately be used in clinics. So I think your gift for words, I think it still comes across just in a different arena. And it's interesting. I really hesitate to draw too many parallels between us because I don't want to come across as arrogant. What I will say is that as an immigrant myself, my whole entry into the world of oncology kind of hinges on us moving to this country, which is how I found out about my father's cancer. So I often wonder, what would life have been like if I had remained in the United Kingdom? Actually, funnily enough, I like to think I would have been either a minister and or an author, which might be flattering myself. But it is weird to think about these alternate realities.
Totally.
Both in terms of our families and our careers,
Where did you immigrate from? Sorry, I know you're.
Oh, yeah, no, you're totally fine. Well, this is the part where I lapse into my Scottish accent. So I'm Scottish, and so
Oh, wow.
yeah, I got to America a bit before you. I got here in '87 from Scotland.
Okay.
And now our audio engineers will tell me to go back to American because otherwise people won't understand what I'm saying. But yeah, I do know what it's like, and I think there's again, I might be reaching here, but there's this like spirit of adventure that really I think our parents are admirable and sort of picking up an entire family from one country and relocating them. I think that's very sort of intrepid and brave. And, again, I'm pushing the metaphor, but I think some research is, again, sort of venturing into the unknown. And like you said, it doesn't always yield dividends. So when it does, that is something to be celebrated. In that sort of vein, Yelena, so these are unsettling times for scientists, and particularly those of us who are in oncology research, and particularly when it comes to funding. And again, I know on some level it might seem almost gauche to talk about money, but I know that you've had success through the years when you've needed to secure funding for your work, and that's included grants from Conquer Cancer. And of course, each grant, whether directly or indirectly, can catalyze you forward. So again, like we were saying for your life story, it's these steps towards kind of the ultimate result that makes treatment breakthroughs happen. Looking back to when you got your first Young Investigator Award, what was the impact of that early funding on your progress?
The impact is incredible. I still remember that feeling. I was in clinic as a fellow, and I got the phone call from Cancer saying that my grant was funded. Back then, they called you on it was a flip phone, my cell phone.
Yeah, yeah,
I remember
yeah,
the moment. I remember what I was wearing. It's really weird because it's very vivid.
right.
It was a very fragile time in my life because I was finishing up, my fellowship. I was about to start applying for jobs. And, I had like a really young kid at home and, trying to do this whole mom and researcher and clinician and working in Memorial Sloan Kettering and not knowing what my next steps would be. So just that phone call and someone telling you that, oh, that proposal you put in is really good and we're going to fund it, somehow just solidified something really, like really on some very deep basic level where I'm like, okay, you just feel like all of a sudden your root is grown and you're like, okay, I'm going to do this. Somebody thought that I am my ideas or how I'm approaching a problem is worth the investment. And it's these little moments that kind of crystallize because I think for many clinicians who are in that watershed area where a decision is made about where to go, and inherently, this is uncertain times, they may not stay in academia if they don't get a moment like that. And it's as simple as, and they can get other moments from other situations, feeling rewarded by a patient interaction or a clinical interaction or something else. And it will steer them away from one path, for example, from research path, maybe private practice or clinical care, which is still okay, but we will be losing.
Yes.
Because doing research, many of us who go into medicine, probably you included, we're good at the patient care, right? We love it. I get, so much positive reinforcement from just taking care of patients. But doing research while taking care of patients is so difficult because it's big and you're not really, really clear about if it's going to be successful. And so just having that funding kind of gives you that pat on the back that all of us need.
Yes. No, so well said. First of all, I love the fact that you remember the flip phone to my teenagers. That might as well have been you found out by telegram. That really puts it in a certain era. But again, look at the time between that moment and then you being on the plenary stage. And I love the word catalyst that we just used. That's pretty incredible. I hear you. It's not just about the dollars and cents that you need to do the work. It's also the validation. And I love your comment too about because patient care to me it's such a human experience. Like when we boil down healthcare, at the end of the day, it's you and me, usually in a room in a very private setting with the patient in front of us. And that to me is the core of everything. On the other hand, that is such a emotionally rich setting, whereas scientific review, I would argue, is almost entirely the opposite. It's an impartial overview of your work and its likely plausible outcome. And I think you're right. It's very rewarding, again, for like a jury of your peers to look at your idea and say, this is worth, of all the things that we could fund, this is worth funding. So I can understand why you would derive significant motivation from that. We started off talking about your groundbreaking work in gastric cancer, but you also have done a lot of work in rare cancers, which tend to be underfunded. Well, it's not particularly surprising that the more prevalent tumors get more research funding allocated to them. It's also unfortunate because we know that funding rare cancer research has an impact that extends beyond single diseases, almost into the kind of realm of histology agnosticism. Can you talk about the challenges of pursuing research that's focused on rare cancers and along with that, why funding that work is so important?
Right. Well, rare cancers for patients, I think is a big isolation and a challenge because those cancers may not have patient advocacy. They don't have champions. There may be some stigma associated with the cancer. So you're not going to have a well appearing, well spoken champion telling patients, you know, enroll in these studies because X, Y, and Z, or asking funding agencies to prioritize their disease because those patients may feel either isolated, marginalized, or there are just not enough of them that are feeling well to show up to fundraisers. And I found that that's very challenging for multiple reasons, mostly because of funding, but also enrollment into clinical trials and lack of really expertise closer to home because many patients don't feel well enough to travel to, tertiary cancer center and get enrolled in these studies. And so we need to work even harder, come together, working through either cooperative groups or larger centers, coming together, sort of getting over well, this is my study. I'm going to be, the lead for it and presenting everything. And banding together. And I think ASCO and in general, I think some of the larger centers in the US, but also globally,
Right.
I think able to do these studies globally faster. And, the challenge is that industry may not be either aware of the targets unless we really kind of present it to them. And usually they need preliminary data until, for them to jump into the study. And two, it may not be financially really it may not be worth it for them to do these studies. So again, we have to incentivize them for various reasons. But I think that's the challenge. Certainly practicing at my institution, and that's part of the reason why I would, I really enjoy working at Memorial Sloan Kettering is that I could do very boutique studies in subset of rare cancers and show a big effect and hopefully help patients worldwide.
That's so well said. There's two sort of comments you made I'll expand on. One is this notion of what's an appropriate time horizon. So for instance, with Matterhorn, you mentioned I think it was an 8-year sort of gestation period. And you're right. Let's go all the way back to pharmaceutical industries. If you're beholden to your stockholders on a quarterly basis, the investment that you're quite literally making today might not actually prove worthwhile until almost a decade later. So that's tough to reconcile. Another thing I've noticed in the last several years, particularly in the area of rare tumors, is a discovery made in one histology may turn out to be incredibly meaningful in another one. And so, for instance, I think about some of the fusions that we come across where actually a drug that was developed for a specific form of thyroid cancer might actually work in one of my biliary tract cancer patients. So I think we are practicing and you specifically are researching an interesting time where there's this really fertile cross-pollination of ideas and more importantly, treatments that can help patients that I think even outside the silo of what we might consider a rare tumor. So, when you do work in the rare tumor space, I think you're actually helping more people than the end might reflect. So I think that, again, your answer, I think, was a real call for support for rare tumor research. As we mentioned more than once, again, these are challenging times for the scientific community, whether you're a physician scientist or I think even more pressingly a patient who desperately needs the resulting treatment and cures that those physician scientists are pursuing. What advice would you have for a scientific investigator out there right now, whether because they're so early in their careers or because they're so focused on an extremely rare disease? What would you say to someone who's struggling to find funding?
I hear you. It's really heartbreaking to get a rejection letter. And it's okay to be upset and to acknowledge your emotions.
Yeah.
And to give yourself a few hours or a day or even a week to just, absorb it and realize it's not fair. They didn't understand your idea, or even if they did, maybe, the funding line was not quite there, and try again. You just have to. And I've given myself this, I just given myself this pep talk as recently as, 3 weeks ago. And I have a program director call with the NCI. My grant didn't get funded. And it stinks. No matter how successful you are and how
Yes.
many grants you've gotten before, rejection hurts.
Yes.
Let's admit it and let's pause there, but just do it again. I think, that's one thing you realize in academia. If you have a fragile ego or thin skin,
Yep.
academia currently, especially, is probably not the place, to do that. And you just have to work on resilience and rethink about the problem, get better preliminary data, get better or different collaborators or the same collaborators, and just clarify your ideas and you will get it. I promise you.
So it kind of reminds me of maybe our alternate realities where we, are in the linguistic or literary world and we're writing. My first draft is never the final product. And I know for a fact I benefit from other people reading my work and editing it and revising it. So you're absolutely right. Reviewer number 2 is always going to sting, but I love your answer for a couple of reasons. One is there's almost always something constructive that can come out of that critique if you look hard enough, provided it's not an ad hominem attack on your own character. And number 2, for someone like you to say that, when I first started going to ASCO annual meetings, my sense of imposter syndrome was so informed. And you look at the people on the plenary stage and you think, oh man, they only got there because every single experiment they ever performed, every paper they ever wrote was flawless. Again, the dominoes fell and now they're there. And in fact, you ask any single one of our peers who was up there, it's quite the opposite. It was a very grueling sort of series of unpredictable results. Some things you thought were biologically plausible didn't bear fruit. Some things that you thought weren't going to work did, that kind of thing. So I actually think it's really brave of you, and I appreciate you sharing it. Listen, we've all been knocked down. I actually have a poster up in my office that says it's all fuel, meaning that, when I have a success with a patient, that's great, that's inspiring. When I fail, and I do fail a lot, what I try to do is just learn from that and do better for the next person, whether that's our clinical care or, to your point, performing research and being really dogged in pursuing funding. Like if you believe in your idea, and I know it's getting harder, hopefully you can find someone even in this climate who will give you that funding, and to your other point, your validation to get started. So, Yelena, there's a question we always like to end the conversations on this podcast with, and it's just this. When you imagine a world where cancer has been conquered, what does that world look like? What does it truly mean to conquer cancer? And do you think we're on the path of doing so?
Conquer cancering to me really means that individuals, when they get the diagnosis of cancer, there's no more crying. There's no more the sense of loss and the sense of this is a death sentence. It's a disappointment, and people say like, oh, well, that's going to sort of, slow me down or derail some plans, but it's not a death sentence. So right now, I think most of our patients, if they did get the big C diagnosis, it's the end of the world for them. I want to live, and we will. Partly, we already are there. Live in the world where even in patients with advanced disease, this is a very manageable issue. They understand they need to find a doctor the same way that they would find a doctor for high blood pressure or heart failure and so forth, and just not be scared. I think that's the moment that is probably, I find, the most difficult for these patients is that first diagnosis when they hear this or read a piece of paper. And I think the litmus test, because you and I can talk about cures and living with this disease, et cetera, but the way that I will know we're actually curing cancer is when now in the movies or so forth, in the popular culture, there's not this stigma of cancer.
So well said. And my career has been relatively short. I left fellowship in 2012, and some of the treatments that I was trained to give are completely obsolete. And I view that not as bad training. I think that's actually a wonderful problem to have. I think you and I and our peers are engaged in lifelong learning. That's why we go to these meetings and figure out iteratively how to get better. But I agree with you. First of all, when people hear the word cancer, especially when it's their new onset diagnosis, the phrase I've used, I think even in this podcast, is the tinnitus of terror. They just immediately, the higher cortex shuts down, their amygdala kicks in, it's fight or flight. This is a lethal threat. I think what you and I are seeing, and thankfully our patients are living through, is a slow paradigm shift. where some cancers really are better described as chronic illnesses. And then, the burden is on us as both scientists and clinicians to make managing that burden as tolerable as possible. I had a faculty member in my fellowship said, Mark, you can't make your patients live longer than normal people, by which he meant, well, we're never diagnosed with cancer. But I do think the asymptote we're approaching is restoring their life expectancy, so their longevity, and also, this is the real trick, the quality of life, to something approaching what it would have been like without their cancer diagnosis. And I completely agree with you. I think that's a beautiful vision for conquering cancer, but one that we get closer to all the time.
That's right.
So, Yelena, thank you so much again for joining us today. And thank you, our audience, for listening to this podcast. Brought to you by Conquer Cancer, the ASCO Foundation. Conquer Cancer is creating a world where cancer is prevented or cured, and every survivor is healthy. You can make a gift at conquer.org/podcast. The participants of this podcast report no conflicts of interest relevant to this podcast. Full disclosures can be found on the episode page on conquer.org.
The purpose of this podcast is to educate and to inform. This is not a substitute for professional medical care and is not intended for use in the diagnosis or treatment of individual conditions. Guests on this podcast express their own opinions, experience, and conclusions. Guest statements on the podcast do not express the opinions of ASCO. The mention of any product, service, organization, activity, or therapy should not be construed as an ASCO endorsement.